Welcome to the Museum of Aquarium and Pet History. My name is Gary Bagnall, and I am the curator and founder of the museum, which has the largest collection of artifacts relating to pet keeping anywhere. This is building number 1. We're going to give you a short tour of this building to kind of go over some of the artifacts that we have, including antique aquariums, bird cages, squirrel cages, dog food paraphernalia, that kind of thing, like dog food cans, dog food boxes, all sorts of things like that. So hold on to your hats and let's go take a look. So the first thing we're going to look at today is the Carnival Aquarium. This is something that would have been in a sideshow carnival, something from like the 1940s through the 1960s until they pretty much ended around that time. There would have been probably one of the young children of one of the carnival workers that would dress up in a mermaid outfit and actually get inside the aquarium. And they probably would have a regulator in there with air coming out of it behind a shell, so she can like go back and forth behind the shell and get oxygen while she's performing her little mermaid stunt. The aquarium itself is spectacular. It's got mermaids that are carved. It's got Neptune in it. It's got more mermaids, mermaid doors. The side over here has a whole plethora of mermaids in it, like a mermaid motif. And then it has the dressing room with a seahorse handle. And has in the back of it here, you've got a dressing room where they would go and they would actually, she'd put on her mermaid outfit to go inside the aquarium. And then on top of the aquarium, probably what they would have is a banner showing both on the top of the aquarium and on the outside, showing See the Live Mermaid, just like this banner right here. So in the upcoming months, we're going to produce several different videos on different aspects of historical pet keeping. Some of them will be on the companies themselves, and like in this case, the Jewel Aquarium company. This is an amazing example of a Jewel Aquarium. They were the predominant manufacturer of aquariums during the Art Deco period. So they started about 1915 and they went through 1950s until they had a bunch of changes. But during the 20s and 30s, their heyday, they produced tanks like this, which is a chrome with bulb edge glass, with chrome leg stand, slate bottom, Art Deco aquarium. This is the only example I've seen of this particular model, and it has the Jewel tag on it, confirming that it is actually a Jewel Aquarium. They're spectacular, and the company has an amazing history, and we'll cover that in a future video. Another video that we're going to do at a future date will be on the Art Deco aquariums and stands, actually fish bowls and stands that they made during the 20s and 30s. This example here is both a fishbowl bird cage stand with planters, brass planters on the side. The bowl is blue glass, which is extremely rare. It's one of the rarest colors that they ever did in fish bowls. And the cage is, I'm not sure, I don't think it's a Hendryx, but it looks very much like some of the Hendryx cages that were made back in that time period. This is probably 1928 to 1932, somewhere right in that realm. And that was the height of the Great Depression, so many people couldn't afford these. They actually were released in very, very limited numbers, and they're very hard to find today. Here's some other examples of fishbowl stands, including Lady Liberty here, which was made by the Chicago Art Foundry, which was actually based in New York. And this was under the Verona trademark. And you could see the bowl is glowing. And that's because this yellow bowl has uranium in it. And uranium does glow. Uranium is something that they used to put in glass. Is it radioactive? Yes, but it's not dangerous because the ions are trapped within the glass itself. And it's such a minimal amount. These are some of the different bowls here. You could see some are amber glass, but a lot of these are Vaseline glass. Some are green depression glass, which just means they don't have uranium in them, and they were made during the Depression period, probably in the 1930s. These two fishbowl stands are Frankart. Frankart was a person who manufactured a lot of different Art Deco type items during the Art Deco craze of the 1920s and 1930s. And in 1928, he only made 2 floor model stands and 2 tabletop stands, and that was it. So it was very short-lived, the fishbowl type items that he made. This one right here, the Frankart purist collectors think is original Frankart stand because it terminates at one point at the base. And a lot of them think this one was actually made at a later date, possibly by the foundry that actually made the stand for Frankart. The interesting thing is the bowls are from Gillander Brothers, and Gillander made the canteen bowls in ½ gallon, 1 gallon, 2 gallons, and 3 gallons. And this little stand is a 1 gallon canteen bowl, which is really rare. I don't think I've seen more than one of that small size. This other one is a 2 gallon canteen, and again, it's that blue glass, which is very, very rare and hard to find. This is a Frankart tabletop of 3 water nymphs, as they call them, with their arms stretched, holding this fishbowl. This was made in 1928. Frankart made very few of these. These were a zinc material that they used, and the color is very classic Frankart green. The bowl is Vaseline glass, so it does glow under black light. And again, it's a very unusual piece made in very small numbers for the Frankart company. This is probably a French aquarium made in the 1800s. It was probably a one-off, or maybe just they made a few of them. It's got a steel frame, and the outside is cement, and they inlaid both scallop shells and chevron shells, that kind of thing. So it's kind of interesting because they just basically made it themselves out of shells. And this is that grotto look that was very popular in France in the 1800s. This is a zinc aquarium, so it's pressed zinc. And most of these that were zinc were made in Europe. So this one probably was German. I think it was German or Austrian, one of the two. A lot of these didn't survive because of the properties of zinc. After so many years, it pretty much loses its ability to repel water and pretty much dissolves. So unless this was kept inside, any that were exposed to the elements actually disappeared, and they were no longer around. It's quite interesting because it's hexagon, and it has all kinds. It has a little fountain in the top of it. Has these little nymphs on the side. Has little lion feet at the bottom. Little crested finials here at the top. So it's a pretty interesting little tank. And right next to it is a tabletop fishbowl holder. This has an original Vaseline bowl, 2 gallon. You find these in green sometimes, but Vaseline is very hard to find on these. Not many of them survived. It's got a lobster holding a little pearl, and it was made by Foldcraft, which this is the only stand I could find that they made, which is interesting because some of these foundries would make, a line of 5 or 10 stands, where this company made one. And they made this one with a lobster on it, which I thought was really interesting. So that's the Foldcraft lobster stand with the lobster holding a pearl. Okay, this is a Parlor aquarium. This was one that was made in the probably late 1800s, possibly even older. It's completely cast iron. I call it the lion tank because it has lion decorations. It's an amazingly rare aquarium, and the only ad that I've ever seen for it said that it was offered to shopkeepers or museums or conservatories, which were greenhouses. So it really was an aquarium that was incredibly expensive in the day and made for basically institutions, zoos, that kind of thing, or the wealthy. Something like this would have cost probably about $150 when it was made. And that, in some cases, is like 6 months' salary for the average worker back in the Victorian era. So this is a Fisk fountain aquarium. This would have been outside in a garden of somebody famous, or it could have been in a museum or a conservatory, an outdoor greenhouse kind of thing. These are very, very rare. Most of these were destroyed during the war effort. During World War I and World War II, people that had broken aquariums outside would donate them for the metal drives. That's why so many of them didn't survive. Also, they didn't make many of them because, like, this particular model probably sold for about $125 in 1875, which was a small fortune. The average worker probably didn't make that in a year. So this would have been a very, very expensive aquarium even when it was made. Now this one is made by Joseph Fisk, or the Fisk Company. They've gone through 4 generations, family-run generations. It's still in business today, making weather vanes. That's what I've heard. They basically did cast iron, garden furniture, urns. They did weather vanes and some other outdoor garden type items. This one has a fountain on the top with little lion heads where the water comes through. It has holders here for plants. Some of them had smaller holders where you actually put candles on them. And then the bottom, you've got peace doves all the way around with this beautiful design. And it weighs a lot because it is solid cast iron. This is the largest one in the collection. We don't have any bigger than this one here. I'm guessing this is probably about 60 gallons. Fisk in his catalog said he made them as big as 6 feet across. And I've never heard or seen one that large. So maybe because he made a lot of these to order, maybe that he just said he had that capabilities, but actually never made one that size. So this again is a Fisk fountain aquarium. Fisk's arch rival and nemesis was the Mott Company. They also made fountain aquariums, very beautiful ones. They made phenomenal fountains as well. Mott was bought out by a very large plumbing type company that's still around today. So this is a cast concrete aquarium. Now this was made around 1915 to 1920s. In the 1917 edition of Goldfish Varieties and Tropical Aquarium Fishes by William T. Ennis, there's actually a picture of one very similar to this one, although it's smaller. This one is 100 gallons. The one that's in the Ennis book looks like it's probably 40 gallons in size. I'm thinking that only one person made these, and he made a few different sizes. Cast concrete is very problematic because it's incredibly heavy. It took 6 people to move it into this museum spot, and they almost dropped it. It was quite a feat. The stand that it's on is solid oak, and I'm afraid to put water in it because I just think it's too much weight. I'm guessing this concrete weighs over 2,000 pounds. You could see that it's inlaid with all these beautiful little tiles to give it sort of a kind of a geometric Spanish revival type of look. But it's a beautiful aquarium, and they've made a few different types of concrete aquariums, and I'll be showing those later on. So this is a trench art aquarium, and what that means is like the term was coined during World War I when soldiers were in the trenches and they were bored and they were taking like shells and they were basically making it into art, you know, vases and things like that. So this one, obviously it's very elaborate, and they probably brought some of this back from the war and they made this aquarium out of it. I'm guessing this is 1915 to 1920, somewhere in that range. It's definitely a one-off. There would be no second one of these. And it does fall under the trench art category, which was predominant in World War I, but it also went into World War II. Some was made by prisoners of war, and it was directly linked to armed conflict. So this is a really interesting aquarium. I have no idea of the manufacturer, and I've been trying to find it. I have nicknamed it the House of the Rising Sun Aquarium because when we got it, it only had 1 or 2 pieces of glass left in it, and they had this sun coming up. So we replicated that all the way around. I think 1 or 2 pieces that were left had this curvature on it. It's a really unusual tank. I'm sure made probably in the 20s or 30s because it has the beveled slate base, and it is cast iron, it's not angle iron. And you see we have some sitters up there, some actually rare ones. Those are actually German sitters made in Germany by some of the doll manufacturers. And there's a Google-Eye girl and a little boy fishing. So these are examples of terracotta ware. Terracotta made, which means they're not glazed. It's like an unglazed porcelain is kind of how they put it. These were made by Johann Maresch, and he was Austrian. He lived in the late 1800s. He died right after the turn of the century, and his son took over the business. And his son, between 1900 and 1910, made a series of fishbowl holders, probably about 20 of them. Different sizes. This was the smallest, up to ones even bigger than this. They're all really amazing. I mean, the paint is just gorgeous. They're very uncommon, seldom come up on the marketplace, but they're beautiful examples of terracotta ware. These are terracotta fish bowls made by Jacob Castle of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And he made a small number of different designs, about 4 different designs. One was a fish tank. He made this design here in 2 different sizes, and then he made the stump design as well. He made them from the 1890s till about 1910. They were actually quite popular, and a lot of them didn't survive though because they were ceramic and of course broke. But they're interesting pieces because they've got that fake wood type design, which was popular in France at the time. One of the most famous goldfish wholesalers or suppliers was Grassy Fork Farms in Martinville, Indiana. They started in the 1890s, and I believe they sold out to Ozark Fisheries in the 1970s. This is one of the aquariums they manufactured in the 30s, and it's what we call the reed aquarium because it has reeds on the side. And you can see the stand. This is exactly how the tank looked when they sold this tank with a stand on it. It's got bulb edge glass as well, and it has on the tank little hangers and sitters, things that they would have sold with aquariums back in the 30s. This is quite possibly the largest betta tank that I've ever seen. It's 1960s, it's stainless steel, has a hood, and it would have these dividers that set right inside inside this tank. It has 10 dividers, so it has 9 different spots that you can put betta fish. And they would, of course, flare their fins and, try to fight, that kind of thing. This was actually quite popular in the 60s and 70s, having these types of betta tanks where you can actually put bettas, with glass dividers right next to each other. Below it is one of the stands that actually was really popular in the 60s. This is a stainless steel stand, and it's spot welded. They were not very successful with these. I don't think that they would have held up under a lot of weight. So they had a very short life, but they're beautiful though. I mean, they're totally made from stainless steel, and they made them in all different sizes. This was in the early 60s, one of the popular stands before they did all wrought iron and type stands. Here we have a parrot cage. Brass wires, brass rope here that holds the stand. And it's not like it's an exceptional parrot cage from the time period, but what makes it exceptional is it came from the Catherine Hepburn estate. So we can't find any information on what parrots she might have kept, but we do know that it was from her estate. And so we're hoping at some point we find out that Catherine Hepburn had lots of animals, including a parrot that was living in this cage right here. This is a French-made aviary in the shape of a French chateau. Made in the late 1800s, this would have been something that was either in a castle, belonged to royalty, or somebody that was very wealthy in Europe, where it stayed for many, many years and finally came to the United States. The interesting thing about it is it has 3 different compartments, and I can't quite figure that out. So, one compartment could be, I guess, canaries, one could be parakeets, and one could be finches. But, I mean, honestly, aviaries are meant to be flight cages, so I thought it was odd that they made it into 3 compartments. But this is an aviary, which is meant to be a very large cage. And cages that are this monumental normally were made in France. Some were made in Germany, some were made in Italy. But this is an amazing example. So this is a baby carriage bird cage. These were made in the Netherlands or Holland in the early 1960s. They were imported into the United States, where probably they didn't sell, or somebody took their expensive parrot out for a walk and it died from heat stroke. We don't know. We don't know the story, but it is a really interesting cage because it's shaped just like a baby carriage, and it's meant to take your baby bird or your parrot for a walk. So that's the story behind the baby carriage bird cage. So this is another great example of something from the Art Deco movement. This is a 1927 spider cage. So it actually has spider webs as the wire that prevent the birds from getting out, and has black spiders made of metal on the wire itself. This was made by the P&F company, which is Paul Ferdlander, and it was made in 1927. These were imported cages from the Czech Republic. They made a huge line of Art Deco cages, and this is one of the most spectacular, the one with the spider on it. So this is a spider terrarium. This was made, well, actually the original one was made in France. This is an interesting story because I saw a picture of this on Google years and years ago, and I just thought it was so interesting, but there was no history on it or anything. Now, I know it's French. It said it was French actually in the Google picture, but the base looks very French-like, and I've seen aquariums out of France, vintage ones, that have the same kind of stand. Again, a terrarium because it's a little too wobbly to be an aquarium. This particular one we actually made. I had my metalsmith, who's incredibly talented. It took him a year to make this, and he made it from the one picture that was on Google, believe it or not. We had to have our glass guy bend the glass for the corners, and he did a spectacular job. I mean, it's a beautiful example of a French terrarium that was probably made, I'm guessing, about 1910, 1920s. So these are squirrel cages. Squirrels were popular pets, probably at the turn of the last century, like 1910 on up to probably 1950s. A lot of people had squirrels. The famous actress Elizabeth Taylor actually had a chipmunk, and she actually did a book on it when she was a little girl. But these are larger ones. These are for either gray or red squirrels. So this, believe it or not, is a chipmunk cage, which is the smallest version of squirrel next to the flying squirrel. And this is folk art. So this would have been made by someone. Maybe he made a one-off, maybe he made just a few of them. But the cool thing about it is this little wheel is like a star, and the little man moves when you move the wheel. So the chipmunk would jump between the wood dowels, and he would move this man back and forth. So it's quite interesting. This is a chipmunk cage that came from Europe. I think this was from Holland, I believe. And it's got two different wheels on each side for chipmunks. It might have been for squirrels, but I doubt it because the wheel looks pretty small for an adult squirrel. So I think it was chipmunks. And chipmunks actually were better pets. If you're going to have a type of squirrel, have a chipmunk or a flying squirrel over a red squirrel or gray squirrel, which are larger and a little harder to tame. This was all handmade. It definitely falls into the folk art category. And you could see he's engraved something on the top there. So these are aquarium ornaments. And it's really interesting because I wasn't really into collecting these until someone kind of brought to my attention how unique they are and how it's kind of something that's going to probably disappear in this format. So you could see the Metaframe ones came in plastic boxes with divers, with cannons, ships, all kinds of things. Some of the older Penn-Plax ones, and Penn-Plax really is the company that brought into the Fort Light these jewel boxes, as they're called, putting the ornament in a little box. And you could see they had UFOs, they had frog on a log. One of the neatest ones is, of course, the surfing mermaid, which is a mermaid surfing on a surfboard. The oldest jewel box Penn-Plax ornaments have the blue, and the second generation after that have this brown color. So if you're out there collecting them, you want to find the blue ones if you can. During the 60s or probably late 50s, they made these instant fish. This was kind of the toy of tropical fish because they put killifish eggs, which killifish eggs can go through a long diapause, which means that they can stay dormant for quite a long time, in some cases over a year. And then you just basically add water to them and they hatch out into little fish. So they made these instant fish. This was by Wham-o. You might have heard of them. Other companies like Quickie Fish right here, they also had one. And other companies like Fish in a Flash, which is right here. These are different eras of the Dynaflow outside filters made by Metaframe. They were originally made by Wilness. And you could see it's in different eras, like from the 60s on up to the 1980s, until they pretty much shut them down. I'm going to do a separate video on Metaframe. A lot of people think that Wilness pretty much created Metaframe, and they did to an extent. They did come out with a lot of the products that are well known in Metaframe's line, but the actual Metaframe tanks were originally made by the Potts Aquarium, which was a store back in the 1930s that started making metal frame aquariums, started the metal frame company with the trade name of Metaframe. So that's really where the name started, and they were the original people that started the metal frame aquarium that we know as Metaframe today. These are fish shipping cans. Before the invention of plastic bags, styrofoam boxes, and air travel for shipping tropical fish, they were actually shipped on trains, and they were shipped in these cans, and they put like block ice on top. They normally had a top with these holes here, so the ice would slowly melt into the can and actually give sort of a water change or fresh water to the fish that were in the can. I mean, some of these fish would be in transit for, boy, up to 20 hours. But this is the way that they did it back in the day, probably from the start of the tropical fish when they came into this country in the 1915, 1920s. In 1922, the Chappell brothers canned the first dog food, and it was called kennel ration. And it had dogs playing poker, the famous illustration of poker playing dogs here. So this was the very first canned dog food, the kennel ration, under the kennel ration brand. Canned dog food became extremely popular, especially when some of the companies said you should mix it with the dry dog food. Then it became even more popular. There were some really interesting ingredients. Horse meat was used in dog food for many years, and that was because after World War I, they had a lot of surplus horses from the war, and they actually used them to make horse meat dog food. In fact, the company that was doing it actually started a horse farm to breed horses just for the manufacture of dog food, but the public didn't like that eventually, so that was stopped. Whale meat was made right up until the 1960s when you saw all the protesters against, save the whale, that kind of thing, and they stopped using whale meat. But that was used in dog food. They actually, at one point in time, they used diamondback terrapins in dog food. In fact, Abraham Lincoln's presidential dinner had diamondback terrapin on the menu. All of you that have dogs have probably at some point in time bought a 10-pound or 25-pound or 50-pound sack of dog food. Well, back in the day, before these super sacks came around, dog food was actually shipped in large quantities in wooden barrels. So here you've got Kennel Biscuit, Austin's dog food, and Purina dog chow, all in a wooden barrel. This is a plethora of Milk-Bone dog biscuit boxes. And these are all old. These are all from like the 1930s on up. Milk-Bone was the company that actually copyrighted the shape of a dog bone. All the dog bones are from Milk-Bone's original copyright. The company's had 4 different owners, winding up where it is today with Nabisco. So this is a very rare advertising sign for Austin's dog bread. What's interesting is this was probably the first American company outside of Sprat's that actually made a dog food. Now they called it dog bread because they figured everybody deserves bread, even a dog. So to get people to buy it, besides, hunters, because hunters usually bought dog food for their dogs, but they wanted, the average person to buy it as well. So they would call it dog bread and hoping that they would increase sales. They at one point in time, they changed it to dog food, but initially all the dog food in the U.S. was called dog bread. What's interesting is there's a comedy troupe out of Canada that called themselves Austin Dog Bread, the Austin Dog Bread Troupe, I guess, which I think is quite funny, actually. But this is gorgeous. It's a woman saying, "Don't all speak at once," feeding one of the Austin dog bread biscuits to all the dogs waiting patiently. This is a composite material of a German Shepherd. And this actually was a movie prop. It was made for one of the episodes of I Love Lucy. And I think there was an episode where she was in a dog food plant or something like that. One of their big advertisers was Strong Heart Dog Food during the I Love Lucy show. And this was one of the props. So this is a parade dress made by the Sprat's Dog Food Company. This would have been made by the workers that were mostly female. They would have taken new dog food sacks, made them into this little dress, and their daughters would have been in a coronation parade for a queen or king, that kind of thing. These are incredibly rare. There's only 3 that I know that exist, and the other 2 are in museums in Europe. Sprat was the first inventor of commercial dog food. He made a biscuit that was kind of patterned after what's called hardtack. So when a ship person got off the ship, they had this hardtack, which was their food, their fast food that they ate at sea, and it would be probably stale by then, and they would throw it to the stray dogs. And Sprat got this idea, James Sprat, because he was over there trying to sell lightning rods, believe it or not. He was an American, and he was in England trying to sell lightning rods. And he sees these dogs eating this hardtack, and he thinks, I think that could sell for dogs. And so he makes it, and the rest is history. He really was the first person to make a commercial dog food. And this is a great example of how famous this company was. He believed in advertising, and he advertised everywhere. He was the first one to really have a booth at Crufts, the famous dog show in Europe. And you could see there's the factory, which is now condominiums, luxury condominiums in Europe. There's a person wearing one of the other brands that they made. And again, the little hat that the girl would wear. So this is a delivery bicycle from Joneseed Pet Stores out of London, probably from the 1930s, right around that time period. And, you know, London has got a lot of little small streets and whatnot. And if somebody that was a local family was buying from, say, Joneseed, and they needed parakeet food or they needed dog food or something like that, you know, they'd have one of the employees hop on this bike, put it in the front little basket, and they would deliver it right to their house. These are incredibly hard to find, anything like this. It's still in existence, but it's really cool. I mean, I love this thing. It's one of a kind. So these are some rare ephemera that we have relating to pet keeping. This first one is the Boston Aquarial and Zoological Gardens, and it's basically showing the first exhibit of a white beluga whale. And that's a broadside for them. They were actually the first public aquarium in the United States. The second one here is called Domesticated Fish, and this was the first book in the United States that was actually written about tropical fish and not just cold water fish or marine fish. Most of the books in the Victorian era up until 1910, 1912 were basically goldfish, marine fish, or they did have convict cichlids and paradise fish, but they didn't really have books on exotics. This was the first exotic book. It was 1915, and it was done by W.L Brind. The first pet shop magazine ever produced was by Augie Roth, and this was April 1917, Volume 1, Number 1. That was the very first pet shop magazine, although pet shops existed back into the late 1800s. That's when they really started, especially bird stores. A lot of the original old pet shops were bird stores. So this was the first aquarium magazine published anywhere in the world on keeping aquariums. It was published by Hugo Mueller, who was a German immigrant into the United States. And he had both a retail store, he had a goldfish farm, he had an aquarium plant named after himself. He bred miniature long-haired dachshunds. Quite an amazing man. And he did 2 series of this magazine. He had the Cincinnati series that was from the 1880s, that decade, and then he had his second series, which was in New York, and that was from the 1890s. And then here, last but not least, we have the collar for a cat called White Heather. This was Queen Victoria's cat. Now, Queen Victoria was a huge animal lover, and if you guys haven't seen the PBS series on Victoria, you should see it because it's wonderful. And you could see she was really a dog lover first and foremost, and she entered her dog in all the cruft shows and everything. And Spratt's always made special gifts for her animals, including this cat collar, which was made by the Spratt's dog food company. She wasn't a cat lover per se, and this cat, the story goes, wandered into Buckingham Palace, and of course the help fed it and liked it, and the Queen found it and also liked it, so she decided to adopt it. And they put it in all these different little exhibitions around the United Kingdom, including you've got White Heather playing the piano, riding in a car, all kinds of things. And he's wearing his famous little collar here that was made for him by Spratt's. So thank you for joining us for our first video for the Museum of Aquarium and Pet History. Stay tuned for the next video, which will be on steampunk aquariums. Also look out for our website, which is going to have the history of companies that exist today or ones that are long gone. If you have an aquarist that you want to basically give us his history, that's someone that you think should be showcased on the website, please send us the information on that as well. Okay, again, till next time.